Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Welcome to the course, Disaster Recovery and Build Back Better. My name is Ram Satish. I'm an Assistant Professor, Department of Architecture and Planning, IIT Roorkee. Today, I'm going to discuss about tsunami reconstruction in Tamil Nadu in two parts. I have divided this lecture in two parts because it is my own research which I have conducted during my doctoral studies. And the first part, which talks about the methodological approach and what are the various approaches, how I framed it, and what kind of framework I worked on, things like that. And in the second part, I'll be actually discussing about the case studies and my observations and findings about what kind of understanding I got it through the case study approach. So let's start with the part one. Before talking about this tsunami reconstruction in Tamil Nadu, I would like to give you an overview of how my journey in the disasters field has started. These two photographs are one of the important photographs of my life. In fact, where my whole journey of my life has taken a different turn. The right-hand side photograph, which you are seeing, which is the reconstructed houses in the Latur earthquake recovery in the Marathwada region. In 1993, it's post 1993, and on the left hand side you can see many of the geodesic domes constructed in Gujarat earthquake recovery. When I saw this photograph of the Latur earthquake recovery, and after some time I visited these particular sites, and even today many of these housing products, they are still vacant. Not many people have occupied these houses. The first question in my mind rose on that day: why these houses were not occupied? Despite of having a very good technical input, which is in RCC structures, geodesic domes, but what made the communities not to occupy? And this question have rooted in my mind. I started working on the reasons behind these kind of unoccupancy. Then later on I worked on my thesis, and then I realized when I went to Gujarat, I realized how the communities are worried about their cultural dimension, and especially why they are not happy with certain prefab inputs, and though it is a concrete structures, why still people were not happy how they were looking after their family and the livelihood aspect. So it opened a different dimension in my mind, and I started looking at understanding the traditional architecture, traditional environments. And with that I worked in Auroville for some time, and that has given me an eye-opener for me to understand how the architects works with the communities. And through that I went to do my masters in Oxford Brookes on international studies in vernacular architecture. So that was the time of 2004, and tsunami have hit the Tamil Nadu, and immediately after the tsunami I did my thesis on the rehabilitation part of fishing villages in Tamil Nadu, and then I worked on the reconciling the interaction gap between the community and the development groups. So this is one of the understanding I had encountered in the rehabilitation stage. Later on, when I was working as a design technician in Benfield Advanced Timber Framing Technologies in Caldicot, our company have got a project on Kashmir earthquake rehabilitation in the Pakistan occupied Kashmir, which United Nations World Tourism Organization have proposed to build some houses, prefab houses using timber frame houses as a part of the tourism development and as well as in the affected areas. So there I was working in the flat pack approaches where I was designing the houses, getting them made, and where I was sending them to shipping them to the Kashmir part of Kashmir, and then shipping flat pack up using the flat pack approaches like we delivered the IKEA furniture. So that is what I was doing, and there I realized a villain role in myself, and because that is where I don't know who are the beneficiaries, I don't know what is the site, I don't know what is the contours over there, I don't know what is the climate. So it's only just I was doing. I realized that that's where there is a gap between what the client wants, what the industry is supplying, and what the beneficiaries are looking about. So this is where I developed my proposal of PhD research. And in the very early days of my doctoral research, which I got funded from the SABE, University of Westminster, London, my initial queries were in the basic terminology, because we use many words very loosely in day-to-day sense. Like for instance, the development. When we say development, how can we define the development? So in my research, what I looked at the development as per my context is, on one side, the usual development process, which is before the disaster also the municipalities or the panchayats to keep taking care of their communities and the roads, water supply, services, everything, health sector. So that is the usual development process. And then the second part is the disaster. When the disaster strikes, different NGOs comes forward for a helping hand, and they work on different funding mechanisms. And it could be a relief stage, it could be a rehabilitation stage, or it could be in a long run it will take up to the recovery and reconstruction stages. So here the actors are very different, and they are very much the temporal in nature. The development is temporal in nature. In the long run, once the relief stage is done and the rehabilitation stage where they are put in a temporary housing for some time, and long run they look for the feasible land feasibility and appropriate NGO coordinations, appropriate financial feasibilities, and then that is where the post-disaster development process works on, which could be a 2-year, 3-year long run process. And before going, I'd like to brief about the technical aspects behind it. First, I started looking at hazard and disaster. It's a very fundamental difference. Hazard is simply a natural phenomenon. It could be a flood, it could be a cyclone, or it could be earthquake, it could be a landslide. But then, what makes a hazard a disaster? So here, one has to understand. In Japan, you are getting 9 Richter scale. In San Francisco, you are getting 8 Richter scale. But still, you are not losing lives over there. But in India, countries like India or Pakistan or Sri Lanka, even a 7.5 scale is creating a huge impact. So it is not just a natural phenomenon which is making an impact. It is the vulnerability which is the people's vulnerability, the society, the community, who are unable to face that, who cope up with that particular hazard and its impact. So that is where the hazard plus vulnerability is equal to disaster risk. In fact, Rohit Jigyasu's, when I referred with Rohit Jigyasu's work, that is again an eye-opener for my study, where he have given me a direction that to a lot of literature from Blakey's work, Cannon, Ian Davis' work, and how these vulnerability, disaster and hazard have been worked out. So for instance, what you can see here is in the disaster response, immediately after a disaster, the development used to follow, right? And then supposedly the vulnerability factor should be very less. But in reality, the disaster response is within the development aspect. That is where you see the vulnerability factor is more. It is within our existing system. That is where the Lewis calls, it is not just a cycle, he calls it a bicycle. A bicycle, when the front wheel rotates with the development, not necessarily the vulnerability is reduced. it may turn in the other direction too, because there are other factors which are the push and pull factors to it. Similarly, as I defined to you as a development, the pre-disaster development, during disaster, and the post-disaster, in vulnerability also, I've classified into pre-disaster vulnerabilities, which are because this is a photograph which I have taken in the early stage of tsunami recovery, in the relief stage, where they have an existing water resources issues. They have people used to gather to get water from these small municipal taps in around the corners, and they have service issues. So they are already in existing vulnerable situations. It could be they are prone to the hazards, they are prone to the daily life activities. But whereas the vulnerabilities as a result of disaster, that is where you lose loss of human life and property damage and infrastructural damage. Whereas in post-disaster vulnerability, this is a photograph of the same place after 2007, which is after almost 2 years, 2.5 years. And still people are still struggling for these basic services. So that is where we talk about these post-disaster vulnerability. So sometimes the vulnerability gets increased or decreased as a result of the recovery process. So that is where it takes into a different form. Then I started looking at how one can assess the vulnerability. When we talk about vulnerability, I'll introduce you to 4 different types of vulnerability analysis. The first one is technocentric analysis. Earlier, when a disaster happens, whether it is a flood or an earthquake, the engineers team used to visit this site and they used to identify where are the cracks coming, where are the joints, where are the reinforcement defects. So which means they are looking at the physical vulnerability of the buildings through a technical inspection of faults and weaknesses and what are the reasons behind this. Later on, after 80s, where Frederick Cunney and had brought the relationship between the disasters and the development, where it has also become a focus of the sociologist and the anthropologist. They often observe that every time a disaster happens, it is affecting mostly a particular target group. So it focuses on the vulnerability of a social group and it is concerned with the causes of the social vulnerability. The third aspect, which is a situational analysis. It focuses just on what kind of group a person or a family belongs to, but the nature of the daily life and how their actual situation changes or which may have changed very recently. It could be through the development input, it could be by the vulnerability as a result of the unexpected different forms of vulnerability. So how a situation is changing every day. The last aspect is the community-based analysis. Here, the communities and the groups appropriate the concept of vulnerability to inquire their own exposed to damage and loss. This is where the most of the NGOs plays an important role. So they try to make the communities aware of their own problems and the issues. So you are trying to engage the community to find the appropriate solutions by a participatory approaches. This is where most of the NGOs work. But in my research, I looked, because I am not a group, I am not an NGO, but I am looking at every day, what is happening every day, how things are changing every day. And I am a lonely researcher working at the situation. So that is where I looked at a situational analysis. There are various models of the pressure and release model proposed by Blakey. And it says how the vulnerability progresses. We have the root causes. It is called the PAR model. It talks about the underlying factors. It could be the limited access to power structures, resources. So you have the gold reserves. It doesn't mean you are a rich nation. Ghana have the gold reserves. The South American countries have gold reserves, but they are not very rich. Singapore, which doesn't have anything, which is still capable of dealing with it. So which means we are talking here about the capacities, how one is able to access to the power and the access. And maybe a certain group is not having an access. Maybe in countries like Saudi, where gender have a limited access to certain aspects. So that is where you are talking about the underlying factors And there's a dynamic pressures, which is talking about the market, the local institutions, the press freedom, and which are again the macro level of forces, the rapid urbanizations, which are everyday changing factors. In fact, the unsafe conditions which often result in the dangerous locations because of the rapid urbanizations, people tend to migrate and form ghettos and slums, or they tend to stay near volcanic places, or they tend to live near the flood prone areas. So that is how the poverty is also one of the underlying factor. And then that is where we talk about the R is equal to H plus V. And that often results into the unsafe conditions. So this basically there is also the underlying factors and how they actually the dynamic pressures which are all actually creating with the natural hazard phenomenon. There is also sustainable livelihoods framework, which talks about the asset framework, where it's a DFID model in 1997, which they have developed how the individuals or groups access their resources, which are basically an assets, to organize their livelihoods and how their capacities make them able to act, engage, and change the world. Apart from this, Tony Lloyd-Jones and Carol Rakudi also propose that there is also the futures like how the infrastructure and development has an impact in the access to these assets, and the vulnerability context, as well as the livelihood opportunities, and also the policies and the institutions, how these actually make the individual or the groups to act upon. But here the thing is, it is not just for the economic necessity where households or groups act upon, but it is with the cultural factors which people manage their assets and make their livelihood choices to act upon. That is where my argument started building up. So till now there have been a lot of research works on culture and the relation between built environment, and there is also a lot of literature on vulnerability and the development. There is also literature from Frederick Cunney onwards, like you can see the disasters in the development. But I try to look all these components, the relation between culture, vulnerability, and development. I am looking from my ontological perspective, the built environment perspective, and especially in a disaster context. So that is where I started reviewing a variety of literature, starting from Bourdieu's Cultural Capital, Kim Dovey's work on framing places, Neil Leach's work on Regina Lim's work. So this is where when I started reviewing a lot of literature on what is culture, and that is where I tried to adopt certain literatures and make a framework in my research in order to understand the role of culture in the disaster development process. So I have adopted Lim's model of cultural environment, which she calls it as a kind of matrix of religion, ecological environment, economy, family structure, kinship, gender roles, politics, cultural interaction. So all these makes how they gives shapes certain structure that create an identity. And similarly, I spoke about the Bourdieu's theory, which talks about the cultural capital, which is the inherited capital, the objectified capital, and the institutional capital. The inherited, which is basically an inbuilt, whether what the qualities you achieve from your family and through your socialization process. But in the objectified, how you objectify in the form of art, and how you can objectify through the architecture and its places. And institutional is more to do with the academic credential. That is where the difference of the popular cultures comes in. And Leach theory talks about the identification of the space, how one can narrate the space, the performatives which define the space, and the repetitive performances which talks about the mirroring of the place. In the context of culture and in the modernization and the globalization, one has to look at, it is not necessarily that we go back to the situation where it was, because people, as Deborah Lupton talks about, people now cannot simply rely on local knowledges, tradition, religious precepts, habit or observation of other practices to conduct their everyday lives, because there are certain other factors also people tend to make their choices. So this is where a predicting aspects, one has to observe from the tradition and the contested aspects of tradition and modern. So in my research, we started looking at the culture, how we can start defining the culture in research. Here, the culture is defined as a sum of total human experiences and accumulated indigenous knowledge within the space, because I'm working from the built environment perspective, that communities rely on giving meanings to their lives and places they live in, through which people habitually develop an approach to survive their everyday life, whether it is in a pre-disaster situation or a post-disaster situation. So mainly my argument lies on how the cultural dimensions of the local communities are not effectively and sufficiently addressed in the current post-disaster humanitarian and development process, to the disadvantage of both the communities affected and the humanitarian and development agencies helping them. So that's where my research question talks about how to understand the role of culture in the post-disaster recovery process and its relation to the vulnerability, especially in particular to the built environment of affected traditional settlements. So my methods have started understanding from two subject domains. One is talking about the change, which is about the morphology, which how the spatial character is changed before disaster and after disaster. The second aspect, when I'm looking at the cultural dimension of it, that is where I have to draw the methods from the cultural anthropology. So that is where it's a synthesis from two different domains of work, that is the cultural anthropology and the morphology, especially in the disaster and development setting. So I have adopted Ian Bentley's work on the theory of responsive environments, where he talks about certain qualitative indices, how to measure a space. When we talk about the morphology and when we talk about the spatial character, one has to understand that how one can measure that change. So what are the qualities one can? So that is where the permeability, legibility, vitality, variety, robustness, visual appropriateness, personalization. But then, as we consider the space-time framework, we are not just looking at a settlement, we are also looking at the different layers of the built environment. Mostly the underlying topography, the natural system, which is an ecological landscape of it, the public linkage system, the plots, the buildings, the components, because these intermediate spaces, these are the various layers of the built environment, which changes in different time aspects, like the underlying topography changes in a geological time, whereas the natural system changes in an ecological time, whereas the public space the changes in the millennia, or the plots maybe in centuries. Like that, we have looked at the change aspect in different layers of the built environment. So I developed this kind of framework of, one is how the ecological environment and the geographical landscape is framing the built environment aspect, especially in the pre-disaster development and the post-disaster development. And then you have the concepts of urban design, especially the theory of response, how we can check these spaces, how it is changing in both the pre and post. And then on one side, the constructs of culture in the built environment, like you have the LIMS model of geography and ecological environment, family, gender, religion, economy, and how these actually interact with the space. My next question was, how many case studies? 1, 2, 3? So what I did was, I traveled around Tamil Nadu. I've taken a lot of statistical information of the damage statistics, what districts have been affected, what are the villages, what are the NGOs working on, what approaches they're doing, whether they're doing in situ or a relocation. Then accordingly, I visited about 17 villages along the stretch of Tamil Nadu coast. And then, while I was traveling, one of the important findings in my pilot study was the geography is very different, not only in land, but the sea also. Until you are Park Strait, you have the shallow sea waters. Further down the Gulf of Mannar, you find the deep sea waters. Also, the geography, it is more plain from the northern side and it's more hilly towards the southern side. Apart from geography, we also notice that community is also very different, especially in the fishing communities. In the northern side of the fishing villages which I have visited, they are mostly Hindu oriented. In the Nagapattinam area, we can see a mix of Muslim, Hindu, and also some of the Danish communities live there. In further south, you see more of the Roman Catholic communities live there. So in that way, I have selected 3 villages: Lighthouse Kuppam, Tarangambadi, Kovalam. In all the 3 villages, Kovalam is a Roman Catholic village. Tarangambadi is a mix, like which is a Hindu, Muslim, and Christian community lives there. Lighthouse Kuppam is a Dalit village. It's a small island. Here, apart from these social, cultural settings, there is also development settings which makes a difference. In Lighthouse Kuppam, Tamilnadu government is involved in it, in the recovery process. In Tarangambadi, the fishermen NGO, South Indian Fishermen Federation Societies, they were involved in it. In Kovalam, the traditional church, the local panchayat was involved. So I'm looking at how different development inputs also vary and how the outcome would be. So I was looking at the qualitative approach. In fact, initially I started with questionnaires. Somehow it didn't work out. So that's why I striked out from the questionnaires. And I see that as I'm looking at the underlying dimension of the cultures, I have to adopt different methods like field observation, which has both direct and indirect participation, documentation and recording, and the interviews. It could be semi-structured interviews with the communities and development agencies and the government authorities, and also the mapping exercises. In fact, to tailor these methods, it took me some time. And there are many methods which I have used, and I have to tailor according to the context. For example, when I approached the village directly in a car and then people were afraid of me. They thought I was a government servant. And they only talked to me about problems. They never talked to me about solutions or how the things were doing. So I was getting a different data. So what I did was, sometimes they were hesitant to give me data. I went to the church, I discussed with the father. I said, can you please allow me? So then he introduced me in the mosque. That is where then onwards, every community, every household is inviting me, and they have started giving the data. And so which means the idea is to approach, in order to do a research, you have to approach the local agency, whether it is a church, whether it's a panchayat or anything. So to build a trust between the people whom you are conducting the study. Like, I have to visit in the mosques, I have to take the group interviews, and especially with gender, many of the women doesn't open up to me because I am a male person. So I have to hire one lady who can speak Tamil, and I could able to respond. So in that, they start speaking about their issues. So which means it's a communication techniques which I have learned. Also, when I asked interviews in the land, the responses were very different. But when I traveled, I used to live as a fisherman for a few months, and I used to travel to the sea in the morning 9 o'clock, morning 4 o'clock. And then in the sea, they used to open up a lot because somehow their belonging their sense of belonging is more to the sea. And they used to open up many things, how they identify the settlement, how they have the indigenous knowledge to understand the risk, and all these things. I've also adopted the mental map exercises. Initially, I have given them techniques of how to draw the maps. I mean, how you can understand the places, legible maps. But then in some cases, they were afraid even to draw. And then I have adopted different techniques, which I'll explain later. In Tamil Nadu, what happened was there's a coastal regulation zone which has been from 1993, and it has been revised 19 times till then. And it was hardly implemented in a practical level. So, but after the tsunami, agencies have thought that we should seriously implement this, and they have tried to move back all these fishing settlements. Like as per the 500 meters of the landward side, they should not construct anything. And later also, they have actually proposed that they have amended this particular thing later on, and then they allowed to some areas 200 to 500 meters you can still permit some constructions. So it has been amended, and this has a serious implication on the land acquisition issues and going back and finding an alternative piece of land and the connectivity aspects, which I'll be discussing in the next lecture, in the part 2 lecture. And this lecture is developed my own work, so these are some of the references you can refer. Thank you very much.